The way we're going to run this is, I'm Paul Grabowitz, obviously, I'm the moderator. I'm going to start off by introducing these folks very briefly, and then I'm going to toss them a couple of questions, see if we can engage in a little bit of a dialogue, and then open it up to you for questions as quickly as possible. So let me start with introductions, and I'm going to go completely out of order because that's how my sheet is. So let me start with Matt Schroyer, who is a researcher at the University of Illinois, founder and president of the Professional Society of Drone Journalists, which you can see at dronejournalism.org. He also built some of the air quality sensors that the journalists are using this week in the symposium here. Example. Got a prop. Good. Always good to have props. Rajiv Bhatia, who was there, is a visiting scholar here at UC Berkeley, formerly was director of environmental health for the San Francisco Department of Public Health for 17 years, and he helped develop some of the noise monitors that the journalists are using this week. The other four are the practicing journalists here, right? So Imelda Baño, there, who's senior correspondent for the Philippine Business Mirror Daily, president of the Philippine Network of Environmental Journalists. Pavel Antonov, right to my left, a journalist, social researcher, activist, co-founder, executive director of BlueLink.net, which is Bulgaria's civic action e-network. Gustavo Faleus, down in the end, who is an environmental journalist in Brazil who specializes in data-driven journalism, and he launched Info Amazonia, which uses satellite and other data to map the Amazonian rainforests. And finally, Judith Gupta, who's here, who is director of the Third Pole Project, which is an online site in India that covers climate change, biodiversity, pollution, sustainable development. Certainly have sunlight here. So we've heard a lot about everything from T-shirts with air quality sensors embedded in them to toy boats that do water measurement to panos and robots and drones. From a lot of scientists and researchers, and fascinating stuff. We're journalists, and I guess it's our job to distill all that down into things that we then use to get information out to the public. So my first question for everybody here is, what are the best ways, and I'm going to start with Matt on this, what are the best ways that journalists, or the best practices that you've seen where journalists have either used sensors or drones in their reporting, or alternatively, for those of you who are about to go back, what are you planning to do, or what are you hoping to do with sensors when you get back to your home country? So let me start with Matt.
Yeah, I think a good place to start would just be to mention that I don't think that sensor journalism is actually that new. It's just been under a different name. I mean, there's specialists who operate in news organizations daily who use devices that sense temperature and pressure and wind direction, and they even make observations and predictions about what will happen in the future. They're just called meteorologists. I think this new term, sensor journalism, is exemplified in a few examples that come to my mind. One is the smokestack effect project by USA Today. And they began by using the sensors that other people use, things like the toxic release inventory from the Environmental Protection Agency, to find out what children in the schools and in the nation were being exposed to, potentially, on a daily basis. But they didn't stop there. They went out and worked with researchers to understand the exposure danger and the exposure risk to those students, and went out with their own sensors, basically simple badges that would change depending on their exposure to things like volatile organic compounds, carcinogens, toxins. And that gave a really good impression of really what children may be exposed to on a daily basis. So that's a really good example. And also I think that that can be extended into drone journalism, because drones really, they carry sensors. They're just mules for sensors. And the camera itself, a visual camera, is a sensor. It picks up visual information. And good examples of that come frequently in disaster reporting, immediately arriving with something that can get an aerial image or aerial view of a very hard-to-reach area. Or what had happened in Dallas, Texas, a hobbyist who was experimenting with this equipment went out and was testing a radio-controlled airplane that was equipped with a camera, wasn't expecting to find anything, but in processing his photos, he realized that he had a photo of a river in the area that was basically painted red with blood. And he gave that to the authorities, which launched an investigation. He wasn't acting as a journalist or trying to, but he uncovered something that I think journalists would definitely want to find. And I think the way you proceed in the future is you collaborate, again, with researchers, scientists, to develop those best practices and understand how to use the tools and even develop them.
Rajiv?
Yeah, so I've worked in environmental public health, and I've been hanging out with journalists for the past few days. I've discovered, I think our work and our sort of techniques are similar, and I'm going to sort of list maybe a couple of categories of sort of applications and maybe an example of each. I think the first is pretty simple. Pretty simple discovery. What sensors can reveal is patterns, spatial or temporal patterns. Epidemics follow those kinds of patterns, and therefore journalists could find using sensors, whether that's a person or a machine, could help find those patterns when people aren't really looking for them. One kind of socially important pattern is the pattern of inequality or disparities. Sensors could, for things that we're not measuring currently to find enough grain, sensors could reveal differences between haves and have-nots in a sort of either an asset or a sort of a hazard in the neighborhood that could be reported. Journalists do a lot of work in holding government accountable. In my experience, and in government, even in a progressive city like San Francisco, environmental laws aren't necessarily enforced, and they're not enforced because even though a clear standard exists, the law isn't monitored. The standard isn't monitored. So, more distributed crowd citizen sensing can reveal that a existing standard is not being monitored, and reporting on that can sort of I think force that action. I think there is sort of also the opportunity of discovery in helping to advance community stories. So communities or citizens may report a particular event or incident, and the evidence isn't mobilized by government authorities or others to provide legitimacy for that event. Sensing can underwrite those stories or corroborate or not those sort of citizen hypotheses. And sort of, finally, maybe a little outside my field, as I think sensing sort of moves forward, every signal, whether it's a noise signal or a spectral signal, we'll start to discover the signatures of different things. So I think James mentioned that a chainsaw has this particular noise signature, and therefore can be used as an enforcement tool in the logging context. A gunshot, which we're using gunshot monitors in the U.S., could be used in a situation where we're trying to prevent poaching of animals. In the same way. So I think as we discover, as this goes forward, these signatures of signals can also be understood and used.
Thank you, Paul. I'm humbled to be sitting here with people like Matt and Rajiv and everyone who spoke earlier who are so good with the technology. I have to admit I am probably the least emotionally connected person in this whole technology. I'm using it as a practitioner in my work as a journalist. Although I'm emotionally connected to other things, nature, healthy environment, democracy, for that sake. And where I come from, these things are, let's say, not working very well. So as a journalist, I find technology extremely helpful, and I've been using it gladly where it helps. Bulgaria, which is my country of origin and a country where I work, the government there may not be as progressive as the government of San Francisco. But as a member state, it's supposed to be imposing laws and regulations that protect the health of people and environment. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. Enforcement is very low. So when 2 days ago I arrived here to the Earth Journalism Network Symposium, I saw these sensors, one that Matt showed us and another one that actually measures noise. I was amazed. I immediately had this vision how I'm taking this back home and installing them on the street of Sofia, where we can actually show to our government how they are not doing their job. They are not meeting the European Union's regulations, the standards that are set, and people are actually losing their hearing and being exposed to particulate pollution. So I'm very happy to do it. But I know there is much more than that needs to be done, and this is what I actually wanted to talk a bit further, maybe later, because we as journalists have this very important role to make the connection between what the technology gives us, the data, what comes from the map, and the actions of authorities, the actions of civil society, what really happens in life based on this data.
Okay. Very deep.
Thanks. Well, since I live in the city that has recently beaten Beijing as being the city with the dirtiest air in the world, I can very easily see that the use of air quality sensors. It's not that the city I live in, which is Delhi, the capital of India, does not have air quality data. It does. And there is data available, but it's not distributed enough. In a city of 18 million, there are 4 data points, which I think is not enough. Whereas, again, on purpose, I'm comparing it with Beijing, which also has very dirty air, but it has thousands of data points because people are measuring air quality with their phones and they're putting it together. So the local government in Beijing is, in fact, being forced to take much more action than the government of India or the government of Delhi. Shows you the power of sensor-based, citizen-based, crowdsourced journalism. And I think that's what's very important. And that's why using sensors in journalism is going to play an increasing role, especially since in this day and age of the internet, when crowdsourcing becomes more important with the help of the social media. However, these are the easy parts of sensor journalism. There are the tough parts. I cover a very large mountain range, the world's tallest mountain range in the world, the Himalaya. Now, that's where there are hardly any sensors by the governments, by the United Nations, or by citizens. And that's where a lot of the problems that are occurring start, because the main river valleys of Asia, whether they're in China or South Asia or Southeast Asia or even Central Asia, start from those mountain ranges. Today we get occasional papers from scientists saying there's a lot of soot up in the glaciers of the Himalaya. How does one, except for the occasional paper, how does one show it? How does one do any proper reporting on it on an ongoing basis? So yes, one needs sensors to do that. Listening to Professor Glaser earlier today, I was very, very interested in asking him, okay, you've got all these water quality sensors, soil moisture sensors. Do you have some water flow sensors? Do you have some water volume sensors that I can use, that I would like to use? Because to me, that's a good proxy for what's happening to the hydrology of these mountain regions all over Asia, and in fact all over the world as a result of climate, and where it's going, and that I could prove. The important thing is, sensors give you the data which allow you to do a story in a way that cannot be contradicted by people with vested interests. That's the main thing. They give you the data which, if properly used, cannot be challenged, contradicted, and somebody can take that data, somebody can take that story that you have done, and then use it to force the authorities to act. The way, in my country, the way almost all good environmental legislation and implementation has happened is by green NGOs taking the public interest litigation route. And they have used this kind of data to go to courts and force the government to act. It's not that the executive has acted on its own. And this, I can see, is a very, very potent tool to widespread that crowdsourcing and move in that direction. Thanks.
Melda?
Well, there are emerging technologies like what we have presented here a while ago. And for developing country journalists like me, it's an overwhelming but useful tools for us. But what I can say is, in the Philippines, if you know where the top texting capital of the world. So we've used SMS reporting to enhance our stories and feature communication stories to the public. So, but what I can say is that using sensor data, it can really enhance more visual in your reporting, and using maps, drones, kites, air and water pollution sensors, technologies. So I mean, it's very challenging for us to use those technologies. First, because of its maybe non-availability in our region, and it's very expensive for us, unlike in the U.S. or in other parts of developed countries. So I think sensor data is very useful because it really leveled up the accountability of policymakers in pushing changes in, like, for example, closing factories or mining companies who are polluting the air and water, where thousands or millions of people were being affected by those pollution. And I think it's really a new technology for us, and it's great for me to be here to learn more about these new technologies.
Thanks. Gustavo?
Thank you. I see the issue of using sensors through two perspectives. One is how to tell the story, which I think Joydeep really put the principles of journalism in first place, and you would use the data coming from the sensors through the same lenses, which are basically crashing your data with the data coming from the government. But looking at the specific case that of the work we've been doing in the Amazon region, we start using sensors. The whole work we do there, it was using sensors, but from satellites, right? Remote sensing. And what actually inspired us to start doing this, it was to capture the scale of the problem that was happening in that region. So we want to tell people that the massive forest fires that happened in that year actually affect the crops in Argentina. So you can look this by seeing satellite imagery. Or if you want to tell the extent of a drought in the Amazon, satellite imagery does this for you as well. But what we're doing here, very interestingly, this week is the other side of the scale, is using sensors for a much more smaller scale, which is covering some kind of blind spots of data, either on water quality. For example, we now start to do a project about water quality in the Amazon. Who would think that the area which has the biggest rivers in the world have a problem with water quality in the cities? But that's the case, and there's no information about that. Government doesn't have. So covering the blind spots are really interesting. Another interesting example I can mention here is one that a professor of the University of São Paulo once brought to us, is that most of people doesn't know that what they smell, they breathe much more pollution while they're in the buses in São Paulo when they are in the street. Because when they're stuck in the traffic, they're basically breathing the bad thing. So giving this scale of the personal level is what I think the sensors can do for the story. But the other perspective that I would like to bring, I think it's what it's interesting about the sensors is on this moment is the narrative of the transformation of journalism as a whole. There is an interesting study that was done by the Columbia University on the Town Center, saying that we are living the post-industrial journalism, right? That you're just eliminating trucks or big printing machines for distributing information, but now we're talking about building networks of hardware things for doing journalism. So maybe it's half-half, and it's interesting to think that we have the biggest survey company in Brazil is owned by a newspaper. Why don't we have maybe in the future a newspaper with a sensor network just to collect data the way they put people outside on the street doing surveys? I see the same perspective, that journalists has always been data organizers in a way. Plus, much more than telling the story, they've been organizing data. Well, they sell space for advertisement or for classified advertisement. And so I think it's the same way. They could invest on building networks of air quality sensors, water quality sensors, and organizing their data the same way they organize business.
Let me pick. Actually, I want to, JD, I'm really curious. Why was the government in Beijing so much more responsive than in New Delhi? What happened there?
Because of citizen pressure. As simple as that. There is almost the last count I heard from residents of Beijing is that 70 to 80% of the people who live and are registered in Beijing are regularly complaining to their local authorities about the air quality. All of them on their iPhones and Androids are monitoring the air quality, and they're texting that to each other. And they're deciding on the basis of that whether to send their kids to school or not. So there is a huge citizen pressure on the municipal government of Beijing. I must say that I'm a complete failure after 30 years of environmental journalism in Delhi. There is no such thing in my city. Yes, we keep writing, we keep reporting in the TV channels, but to get people to actually stand up and take notice, we have not really succeeded. Once we did, it was in 1999 when a large NGO used a lot of reports to go to the Supreme Court with the air quality of Delhi, and through the Supreme Court forced the entire public transport fleet, all the taxis and the tuk-tuks and the buses and the trucks, to move from diesel to compressed natural gas. It did actually clean up the air quality of Delhi for about 10 years. The air quality standards in 1999, it became as bad as that again in 2009 with the increase in the total number of vehicles on the road. So for 10 years, yes, it worked. But now we are back to square one. So that's why I'm thinking that unless people start realizing, and the costs are very, very high. India doesn't have health insurance, and what was the last number that was seen? Some 24% of kids below the age of 7 in Delhi have asthma. 24% is a huge percentage. So that kind of thing. So if that's why I'm saying that this kind of a sensor in every hand almost, or in every neighborhood, may actually give the citizen that kind of empowerment, that feeling that, yeah, we put it together, these are the numbers, show it to the government and force the government to act.
I just wanted to pick up on your question, and actually something that Joydeep has been very good in highlighting, the connection, the power that we as journalists can evoke when we write the right story about the data we receive through the public's actions, alerting the citizens about the threat on their health, and that's when we can get the authorities to act. And I wanted to share briefly a story. It's a story where the organization I work for, bluelink.net, which is a virtual network in Bulgaria, has been deploying over the past years maps, virtual maps, which show different problems. One of those maps was one related to tobacco smoking. We had big problems with tobacco smoking, and we had legislation passed. Unfortunately, we didn't have sensors, and maybe it's a technical issue whether sensors could be used on this one, but we have had people actually feeding the map and reporting on the story. And what happened, what turned out, was the only way how we could get our legislators to act, to change the laws and to enforce the laws, was by getting people's attention and getting people on the streets when necessary. So my point was, again, the data we had on the map was one thing. Our job as journalists, and here I may disagree slightly with Gustavo, was to tell the story in the best possible way so that it strikes the right chords and get people to act. And then see how people react on this and change government decisions.
Well, let me follow up on that, because there's been a lot. I just made some notes about how data can't be contradicted, which I thought was fascinating. And unlike us as journalists, we write something and it gets contradicted all the time. It's more visual. It holds people accountable. People get engaged in it, and it's much more personal. So what is the role left for the journalist? Let's say we all become data journalists or drone journalists or sensor journalists, and then we're all out of business because everybody's just using drones and data and sensors. And what's left for us?
This is not a story. This is something that is used for the story. Without the human face, you don't have a story. I mean, this is a room full of journalists and journalism teachers, so I didn't mention that, but we all know that, right? Without the human face, you don't have a story. So yes, the story is still there to be written. It has to be written.
I'll be brief. I think the name of this seminar just says everything. It's the ground truth that we do. The journalists in the end do the ground truth. And I mentioned this in an earlier session today, that, okay, I can see that huge polygon of deforestation using maps from NASA or from the Brazilian government, but the story behind that patch of forest that was destructed is incredible. It might be an indigenous person who did that, or it might be a farmer, or it might be indigenous people with farmers together doing that thing. So it's really a complex system which you bring by telling the story.
Go ahead. Anybody? Imelda.
We all know that media plays a critical and important role in relaying information to the public. And it's also the role of the journalist to get third-party, second-party, or fourth-party information for verification of data being gathered. So I think we have to have a distinction what media's role really is and experts' role is. You know what I mean? And collaborate with each other to give credible stories.
I think I maybe just take exception with the idea that the data is sort of going to be always uncontested, or data is going to win. And I don't think anyone sort of agrees. I think that the situation right now is that you have competing expertise. And the journalist has to kind of make sense of that sort of competing expertise. And the new thing now is that there's technologies to create expert data is now sort of in the hands of the citizen and everybody. But there's still going to be a number of problems that are solvable to make that data, first of all, credible and valid. When it's not just that you can have a sensor. That sensor, you need to take a measurement at a particular time for a particular length of time with enough samples, and so there's a whole there will be that kind of, I think, sort of learning curve, and even when that happens, I think one of the great things about the sort of citizen sensing is that by globalizing this, we all have the same phones with the same operating systems. We'll all be collecting, we can all collect measures in the same way. There's going to be great power in that, but we should probably expect that there is counter expertise. So if this information supports a particular perspective, even if it's truth or the right, you're going to see, just like there's counter science, you're going to see some other interest groups, some maybe putting out other data with other journalists, and so I think the journalists are going to have to make sense of all this and present it to us in a sort of a fair way.
I agree. We live in fortunately a very active fact-checking culture right now, where anyone can pull out their phone in the middle of an interview and do a quick search, saying, "No, that's not right." It says right, or even pull up research that may contradict an interview happening right now. I worry that journalists risk becoming obsolete if they also don't have access to check government data or produce their own data where the government doesn't have it or can't obtain it. or won't give it out even if they do have it. I mean, that was the case with the Fukushima nuclear disaster, was that we were providing drones to Japan to monitor the situation on the ground. And we gave that information to the government of Japan, but that government did not bother to interpret that for the people. It behooves us to learn how to use these tools so that we can be more accurate and provide like evidence-based journalism, as opposed to just quoting other people or other experts. We can, thanks to the lowering cost, the cost is getting down, the complexity is getting down. The barrier to entry is never been lower right now to develop a sensor. So I think it's very important to develop this as a tool for the future and realize that we do have to produce our own evidence to back up what we have to say in a report.
Okay, I'm relieved. I just want to make sure I wasn't out of business as a journalism professor.
No.
Okay, you guys all have raised a related question, which is what are the difficulties or the challenges we're going to face with these? What are the problems? What stands between us and deploying these things and then writing about them and affecting change? Anybody?
To start with the cost, obviously. So I don't know. It's a pretty low cost now, so that's good. And if it can come into every phone, it would work. That's not the problem. But yes, the other problem that Rajiv and Gustavo also pointed out is that it's going to be of credibility, and you can get credibility only after you get some standards in place, after you have calibrated these instruments to those standards. So all that is in the future right now. Matt's got an instrument to measure particulate matter. Now, if X says Matt's instrument is faulty, then there has to be a third party, a credible third party, which says, yeah, no, Matt's instrument is right. So all that is in the future. So these are obviously obstacles to be gone through. However, this would happen in every case. That would be in the case of when the internet came in. That was the case. So with every technology, that will be there, but that's no reason to stop.
I'm going to take a slightly different take on the obstacles. Earlier today, with the other journalists at the Earth Journalism Network's training, we heard an expert who showed us this marvelous mapping project in the Amazonian forests. And he said something that impressed me a lot. He said that we can bring up the data, we can show what's happening. We can't say whether this is good or bad. We can't say whether it's good to deforestate or maybe this is such a good business opportunity for someone. And so this is where I think the big problem lies. We are on a front line as journalists. We are the soldiers of truth, so to say. We are the ones who have to establish what's good and what's bad, what's the public's interest, what isn't, and that's the biggest challenge, the biggest obstacle there. We have had in Eastern Europe numerous occasions recently I have come across where one and the same set of data is read entirely differently by governments and different governments, or governments on one side, activists on the other, and the data is neutral. Data doesn't have its own voice. We are the voice, we are the brain, and we are the ones who have to make sure the right message goes through. And I think this will be the difficult part, knowing what's happening with journalism these days, knowing how less time there is for journalists to do proper investigation, to work with sources, and how much pressure there is on journalists to comply with certain economic interests. So that's the difficult part, I believe.
A couple of things I think people have mentioned, sort of the validity issue. A lot of it, technology is not necessarily developed for the world's priority needs, and so sensors that are on hand for a variety of things are not necessarily there for the priority needs of the globe. And so I think that while there's lots of untapped opportunities to use the satellite imagery and the air and noise and the technology that does exist, there needs to be sort of also kind of a more bottom-up, here are the problems we need to measure better, And here are the sensors we need. So there's a sort of some supply for that demand that isn't just using the sort of the toolkit, the first world development, the first world toolkit. I think a second problem is recognizing that these systems need to remain, for their many sort of democratic purposes, participatory and distributed, and not become someone's expertise or again, boxed off, walled off expertise. And then I think a final point is that this is all new, and as it does, and it has a lot of untapped power, as that power is unleashed, and it's a force for change, we may start to see obstacles to access for that data. So if we rely on satellite data, and that satellite data is used by citizens and journalists to affect sort of policy change, access to that data might get sort of restricted or compromised. And I think we need to be attentive to that, and it can be compromised in very very kind of bold ways. Okay, we're no longer going to release this data to you, or in subtle ways. Okay, it's going to take a year or two for us to get it to you. Yeah.
I want to add a thing that I more on the management of projects in newsroom, which might be a challenge for these things. I've been seeing a lot of nice projects about data journalism emerging right now, but I see a lot of lack of consistency in a lot of the projects in terms of like the length of these projects are done. So if we were talking about collecting data, not necessarily this data needs to be owned by the media company, let's say, but these projects for having a historical series, they need consistency. And what I've been seeing in some of these projects of data journalism, they're very fancy, very fashionable to launch, and they finish in a year or, I don't know, a few months. But there is a great opportunity on working with data of creating these journalist platforms, which is something really new. You're not just creating a story, but you're creating a platform, an application where people are going to relate with that information for a long period of time. And that's what we're talking about the sensor journalism. I might create my own network of water quality sensor in the Amazon, and I ought to do this for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years to having relevant results. So I cannot lack funds next month if I want to do something relevant. That's what I've been questioning about these data platforms that are just like coming and going, and so consistency is a big challenge.
In terms of risk, I think journalists really need to be important or pay attention to kind of making sure they're not misleading the public about what data they're able to obtain. I think that the cicada tracker example was excellent because behind the scenes, if you were a person coming to the cicada tracker website, it would walk you through an example of how to make a cicada tracker yourself and tell you why it's important and what the readings mean. So there's an educational aspect that you need to get right. That's very important, or else there may not be proper interpretation by the public on it. I think another important thing is privacy. We collect data today, and we might say that well, we're not tagging your GPS data, so we can't track where you are. But if you have enough data points, you can find someone. You can triangulate them with a variety of means. Like for instance, I brought the cube for the particulate sensing cube today, and so this also goes in my home. And when I come home and from work, it will spike. So you can learn from that yeah, I'm home, or someone's home, or nobody's home. When my wife cooks, it will go up. When I cook, it goes way up because I burn things. But the point being is all that can be used in ways that we may not think about today, but in the future we could understand. I think an example of that is some researchers from the University of Illinois recently published a study on how each accelerometer in a cell phone has a unique footprint. There's a standardized process to create and churn out accelerometers for cell phones. but you'll have a little bit of difference in each little accelerometer. And so that means they're uniquely identifiable. And then when you ring the cell phone and it vibrates, that creates the stimulus whereby you can measure that and potentially identify that footprint. So that's an example of something that's very hard to get away from because you need that data to be precise. So you can't necessarily scrub it because that will throw off the readings. But just to be cognizant, maybe develop some kind of, there's been talk of maybe a bill of rights for users for this stuff. So be upfront about what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and potentially deleting it someday if need be.
Well, I think challenges lies ahead, but it's clear that it will be used to create data where there was none before, and it will influence like what I call a top-down government action and bottom-up civic engagement to help communities. And well, some of the difficulties or challenges for developing countries like me are its availability of sensor technologies, affordability, the know-how, and of course the standards.
There was already a mention of this. Have any of the governments that in your countries restricted data, or are they? I mean, has anything negative happened already where you're seeing a pullback from this sort of? Go ahead.
Okay, not data at the local level, not pollution data or something like that. It's not restricted, but many countries, including India, Pakistan, China, restrict data on water flow in transboundary rivers, which can be very crucial to understand what's happening to these river systems. And in fact, the government of India has a rule saying that they cannot give it out. And this is exactly why I wanted to know about that water flow meter, because we now have a plan that, okay, the government doesn't want to give us the data on what's happening in the Indus or the Yangtze or the Brahmaputra or the Ganges, that's fine. We are going to put our meters there, and we are going to put this data out in the public. And that's exactly what we are planning to do. Yes, so there is restriction in data, and it has implications. I know that exactly because of this, a multi-country project of the World Bank in South Asia on how to do a basin assessment of the Ganges basin between Nepal, India, and Bangladesh was first starved of data by all three governments. Then when they used satellite data to do the modeling, all three governments contested the satellite data and junked the report. So yes, there is a problem to be solved only by moving it, as Imelda says, from the bottom up.
I've been in a meeting years ago with a government official from the Ministry of Environment in Bulgaria who said bluntly, I'm not giving any data on biodiversity. We asked why. He said, because once we put it out there, first people who will go is the poachers and the hunters. They want to hunt bears, they want to hunt big animals, and so we don't put this data out. So he had a good reason. But this was, I would say, a rather exclusive case. In the majority of cases we have, the governments are holding back on their data because they are afraid of the consequences. And we've been using Access to Information Acts and all sorts of tricks to get data out on issues that affect public health, biodiversity, and use of land. Deforestation is a major problem. So yes, and in many of these instances, there is regulation. There is, I'm sure you have it in the US. The European Union obliges every government to publicize data. And if they would do that properly, there would be probably no problem. But the data that's publicized is often quite good, and then the next problem comes that someone has to interpret it for the public and tell them what's the problem, and this is what the governments are not very happy with.
Interesting. Okay.
And this is what we as journalists could do quite well.
So we have a revolution of sensors, and then the journalists are Lenin, I guess, leading the revolution. Just curious, the privacy issue came up. Matt alluded to it. Is that come up at all in any of your countries? Are people worried about the amount of data that might be collected about them, or private information, or is that not sunk in yet?
I think so. One indication of this is nobody's really willing to share their location on Twitter or Facebook. The two social networks who give you the option of putting your location, it's very low, the number of people who actually share, unless they don't know. But when you know that you can opt out, you will. So you have other tools like Instagram, which are massively used by media today because they don't give you the option of opting out. If you're posting a picture on Instagram, if I'm not wrong, you're always giving your location. And so people use. I think there is a lot of privacy concerns, mainly from last year. That's more clear for everybody, and I think it's good that there is, right? Because that's the risk and the beauty of the data age. There is a lot of opportunity, but if that someone wants to do bad things with that thing, with that amount of data, it's totally possible.
I'd make the distinction between environmental data and personal data. When I was the environmental health director, everything we collected, everything, business regulatory information, it was all public. There was no confidentiality protection. The inspector's name, the business owners, it was all clearly public under sort of law. In the whole rest of the health department, it was all private. So I think that when we're collecting data about places and government regulated activities, that's public domain knowledge. I echo the point, even in the States, that while the laws exist, there's still a fairly strong bureaucratic resistance. The culture isn't there supporting the ease and legibility sort of the data. There aren't data standards, so it's a mess once you get, when you get it, if it's important, it can often be a mess to clean up.
Just a quick aside, it was in the paper the other day, actually, that in this country, there's all this data that's collected when you drive your car, buy your car, but the people who don't have access to it are the car owner. And it gets dumped when you go in to get your car repaired, and they know what's going on, but you don't as a car owner. And it's a great example. And the government hopefully will intervene. We'll see. Some questions from the audience. Let me just read them. Yesterday, a journalism professor wrote, not me. Yesterday, a journalism professor wrote that journalists are now working in tech. Any reactions? Who can I ask? So I'm not clear. What do you mean working in tech, or what did he mean working in tech?
Well, what the gist of the article was, he was in the Niemeyer Institute, and it was that journalists are now part of the tech industry. So this is because there's so much tech involved in journalism, and so much journalism involved in tech. So where does that leave us?
I think we went through this as you raised this issue as well, and I think we all said that to us the tech is the servant and we are the masters. The human is the master, not the other way around. Without the human face, there is no journalism.
Everybody feel comfortable with that?
I don't think it's been so different. I mentioned the post-industrial journalists, but maybe we're not so much post-industrial journalists as we would like to think. It's just a different kind of hardware. You think it's because there is, of course, you should do the distinction between journalism and media industry, but they often walk together. Who owns all the networks of broadcasting? These are media companies, and this is a heavily tech industry as well. So, or printing machines. I think journalism is a technical profession. I mean, although there is a lot of good principles, humanistic, but there is a lot of technical skills involved and formats and things. So I don't see as necessarily a bad thing that we are aware that we are part of this information technology sector.
I am maybe getting them not a journalist perspective, but just really big picture. It seems for many centuries, industrial capitalism made the world opaque and complex and inaccessible, and I think information communication technologies are now creating the means to make the world more known, more legible. And so it's again, there's an opportunity to regain mastery over, for humans to regain mastery. But I think that remains a battle.
I suppose there's a question of independence in there, in that are we too cozy with the tech industry and losing agency in the process? Earlier today, yesterday, Earth Journalism Network people were in the Google offices, understanding how to use Google software for journalistic purposes, and I have heard criticism that in working with researchers that you might be representing their bias, and that could endanger the independence of your reporting. But I think there's also an answer within tech, which is to keep everything open source, right? So, I mean, the mantra is always sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I think when we're kind of treading into this new territory, it's important to also shine that light on ourselves as journalists and say, okay, this is the sensor we were using, this is why we were using it, this is how we were using it. And by the way, here's one you can build yourself, and kind of replicate this. So I understand the concern, and I think the journalists need to be aware of that and keep everything above board.
I didn't read this article, so it's difficult to comment. But I can't help but bring up the basic question, which in fact was part of my PhD research in the United Kingdom some 2 years ago at the Open University. I asked it to the journalists back in Bulgaria, which was, what is it actually? What does it mean for us to be journalists? When we say tech and journalism, which part of journalism does it really affect? And if we look at even the general description, people like W.L. Lance Bennett here in the US and others have defined these three major normative frames that describe journalism, and one of them is the professional, the way we do our job. The other one is our social and democratic responsibility, and the third one is our responsibility to the business, to our employers, to their money-making interest. And I think technology speaks to the first and probably to the last of these three, but the middle one, the fourth estate theory, the responsibility of journalists to stand for the rights of those whose rights need to be defended and tell the truth. We don't need technology for this. My friends at The Guardian and the BBC in England say, all I need is my pen and my notebook. So I don't think journalism and tech are so interdependent. We just need, as they said, technology is our pen nowadays. We need to do our job.
Yes.
For a very short comment. I think it's a matter of collaboration and exchange of expertise and bridging the gap between and among experts and journalists.
Here's the flip side of that question. What are some ways we can connect scientific communities in academia with journalism communities of practice when it comes to censored journalism? So rather than needing to distance ourselves, the suggestion here is we need to collaborate better. And how do we do that? How do we work together with academics on this?
I work with academics in interesting places who are also doing work in informal environments, and journalism can be informal science. I think that there's a belief, perhaps on behalf of communication specialists and journalists, that scientists really appreciate someone to interpret their findings. But if you ask a scientist, they might say that we don't really need an interpretation, or that's not what we're looking for in terms of a collaboration. What has worked in the past for some people is finding people in the academic community who enjoy the outreach, who want an opportunity to collect more data for research, to test a method, to test some equipment. So it's important to always be on the lookout for people who might be interested in a collaboration for the purpose of public outreach.
So public health, different from sort of, I think, medical science, has collected an incredible amount of information on what would make our lives collectively better, healthier. We know, that our cognitive function works better if we're around trees. We have absolutely bumbled the job of communicating that information in ways that shape society. Others make similar arguments for similar things, sort of from different domains, and but with few exceptions, we really haven't. And while there may be the public health successes that are really notable, there's a huge landscape of sort of information. I think there's a huge, I think journalists as storytellers connecting facts to human experience and making persuasive stories is something that science desperately needs. It's I think that those scientists need to be. They're often very, very protective of their, and other scientists are their knowledge domain. No one else will understand this. No one else. People will misinterpret it, and so that kind of protectiveness inhibits the sort of broader sort of awareness. So I think journalists could help liberate that information.
This is a question I hear all the time in developing countries. How can scientists interact better with journalists and get their points of view across? I didn't really expect this question to come in over here in the country of the Scientific American and the Society of Environmental Journalists and the World Federation of Science Journalists, etc., etc., etc. But yes, there is a point that scientists, including social scientists, do have a point when they say that they are not given their due space in the media. But on the other hand, scientists and social scientists quite often do not understand that the media is an independent animal, that they will not carry what the scientist says as the form of a press release. They're not your shorthand people. So that understanding needs to be there in both directions. There is definitely need for the media and scientists, including social scientists, to talk and understand each other. In the area of censored journalism, this will become even more important, because then there will be more instruments, more tools available in every hand. And I'm sure academia will also study those.
Won't you all be going back? I mean, if you're going to be deploying sensors, aren't you going to need scientists, people, experts in that data to avoid misinterpreting the data, gathering it incorrectly, and so on? So aren't we going to become? I mean, we're going to have to forge those.
We talk to scientists all the time in our job. I mean, as scientists and social scientists, we talk to them all the time, and I would love to be talking to a wider spectrum of scientists and social scientists.
You all going to be doing that, I assume, when you get back?
Yeah, so the tool that we've been working on in the Earth Journalism Network this week related to particulate sensing relies on a sensor. I'm going to pull a sensor out of my pocket just now. It's not a cell phone. So this is the sensor board that receives the information from the sensor, which is here. And so this is about a $15 sensor. It picks up particle counts, so how many particles of a certain size per cubic foot is what it's trying to tell you. And as a non-scientist, I don't know how accurate this is. Luckily, there's been research actually here at UC Berkeley into exactly how effective this is. How does this compare to more expensive units? How accurate? How precise? And so we use this because that there has been that research that shows that it may be comparable to more expensive units, but we can purchase 10 of these where we can only purchase one more expensive unit. So I think it's important to test the tools and to look at the research that's in the public domain to see, are we even in the right on the right planet in terms of using the right tools? I think that's one way to help solve it.
This is a question that is actually for you, Matt, but I want to broaden it a little bit to everybody else. How are you managing the current legislative ambiguity about the use of drones?
Carefully. With a lawyer.
Can public media claim non-commercial status, which is an interesting twist. But I also want to broaden it because I'm curious what are the laws governing drones for the rest of you? Because it's very, very different in other countries from what I've seen. So, Matt, start with the U.S.
It's kind of a big question. In short, if you go to the FAA and say, I would like to fly a drone, they would say, sure, you can fly a drone, absolutely. We need you to fill out a certificate of authorization if you were a part of a public entity. So universities can do this. Public universities can do this. Any number of federal agencies can go through the COA process. But if you're a private individual, working for a company trying to do this, they would tell you, you don't need to fill out the COA application. You need to fill out an experimental certificate. And so both of those are options, but they take, if you're not familiar with the process, maybe 30 days or more. And they can't let you fly everywhere. Like, you can't fly a drone over Washington, D.C. And a number of other places. The flip side of that is that the FAA has slapped someone with a fine. His name is Raphael Perker. He's not from America. He's from Switzerland, but he came to America with a 4-pound foam RC glider that can be called a drone depending on your definition on a drone. And the FAA thought that he was operating it recklessly and fined him $10,000. And his lawyer, Brendan Schulman, helped him file a lawsuit against the FAA in the National Transportation Safety Board Court, which is a special court for cases involving the FAA. And that court said basically the FAA did not go through the proper procedure to make those rules in the first place. So if you're a federal agency, you're not elected, you're appointed, and Congress says that you can't make regulations unless you go through a formal procedure, and that involves first coming up with the rules, announcing them to the public in the form of a notice of proposed rulemaking, which goes in the Federal Register, and the FAA has to accept comments, and then there's a period to digest the comments, and then the final rules come on, and the FAA hadn't done any of that for drones. So it really kind of depends who you talk to, but at least one judge in an important court has said that there's basically not regulations for drones yet because the FAA hasn't made any proper ones. So that's kind of where we stand in the United States. I know it differs from country to country. The most progressive are Canada, Australia, and the UK, but that's
what about the rest of Melda? What's the situation in here? Okay. Can you guys fly drones?
No, we can. It's the lack of I've never used it very much, a lot. Recently, we had a report where there was a drone pilot involved, and there was, according to him, there was no restriction so far. So it's open. It was used during demonstrations last year a lot. There was some newspapers flying over the demonstrations.
You guys?
If I'm not mistaken, it's already commercially possible anywhere to buy a little flying device to which you can attach your camera and navigate it so you can take your selfies from top. Some of my journalist friends in Bulgaria wrote me recently they're planning to purchase such things. If I know well the habits of legislators in Eastern Europe and further east, everything that's not allowed should normally be prohibited until it's allowed. But there is this other thing that's recently the bigger trend, which is that everything that makes money is allowed. So it's a guess. On my side, I think if there is a company that's making good money on selling drones, this will be allowed. But I'm going to check this. You made me curious.
I have a strong suspicion that the Defense Ministry of the Government of India is paranoid enough to have prohibited the whole thing altogether, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Another question. If you could create a sensor to monitor any kind of environmental or health indicator, what would it be? So what's your dream sensor here?
Corruption.
I wanted to get one of those co-robots to like follow legislators when they go behind closed doors. I thought that would be a... Yeah, right, there you go.
I'm seriously thinking, after the day spent here, that we should be able to map things like journalistic independence in many of the countries around the world. We should be able to map attacks and pressure on journalists and the way journalists are able to do their job. I'm not sure how sensors could help, probably one way or another, but I can't help it. It's funny, I'm sorry, but every time you say this word sensor, it's a new term for me, and another term that's not so new to me sounds the same, and every time censor journalism rings like censorship journalism to me, and it's really horrible. So I hope really we can use these sensors for something better and to sort of make our job freer of controls and everything else rather than the other way around. But anyway, maybe the others have a better take on this one.
Well, drone journalism, we have the same problem.
Oh, right.
I don't know. So we have a lot of sensors right now. I think the real issue is the accuracy and the price. I mean, the particular sensor that we are using is very good for the price. What we'd like to have is the more expensive particulate sensors go down in price and go up in ease of use. So I mean, there's a tremendous there's a cornucopia of sensors out there, and that are already in the ecosystem, and it's just a matter of time before a journalist gets a hold of one and figures out how to use it. And I also think that the answer is not necessarily high tech. You can do a lot with low tech badges. The USA Today report hinged on low cost badges that measured volatile organic compounds, or as was said earlier, looking at plants and and people as living sensors too. So
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think for me, my dream sensor would be, I don't know how to call it, but it's for an early warning system for typhoons and disaster. Because as you know, Philippines is at the front line of typhoons and disasters. We have like an average of 22 typhoons a year. So I think it will be much helpful for journalists, like a do-it-yourself sensor.
There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. Yes, as Imelda says, in the coastal areas, it would be a storm warning. In cities, it would be an air pollution monitor, including particulate matters, which is dust. But what I would love to see is added to that dust the basic sulfur dioxides and NOxes and the carbon monoxide. I'm sure it will increase the price manifold, so that's a problem to be solved, but that would be the ideal. In rural areas, it would be a monitor that would be able to measure what's happening to the water and agricultural runoff after an irrigated field. So there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this.
Okay, I think we're going to... Anybody else have any last things? Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up.
Just that, I'd maybe echo a water sensor. Somebody dips it in the water and tells it's drinkable. Really, that's completely... Just a dip, like a piece of paper dipstick that will react with the DNA of various organisms. Somebody could figure that one. But you take a problem like traffic safety, where there's 1.3 million deaths a year in vehicle accidents, and you have existing sensor technology, you have photo enforcement that is a widely deployable sort of tool, but it's not being done for political reasons. So again, it isn't the technology that's where I think we're lacking, but the human good use of it.
Maybe I take my chance on the issue with the science and journalism, which I think is quite obviously central in this discussion, because sensors are there, that they exist, they are in the hands of scientists, they are in the hands of government. Early warning systems are place their government strategies. But every now and then we see how they don't work. And so coming back to the issue of journalism, I'd hate to be constantly the devil's advocate and maybe hijacking the discussion here. I am very enthusiastic about sensors and technology, that's for sure, but I want to come back, refer to the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote this lovely tiny book in 1998 describing the journalistic field. And he pointed a very important issue, which I think we as journalists and actually scientists should be aware of. He said journalists are now becoming instrumental in imposing on society their modes and models of operation. So we, scientists, he says, are now unable to do our job and communicate properly because they televise us. They want us to fit everything in 3 minutes, and they want us to be techie. So Pierre Bourdieu back then warned that scientists should refuse being televised. They should hold their ground, use their sensors, I would say, and do the job properly. And I would dream that governments and scientists would do their job properly, so we as journalists could also do our job properly as well. It will be very dangerous, I think, if we try to also take care of technology and sensors ourselves. This would be probably the end of democracy. I don't know. Anyway, I hope for the best for all.
All kinds of sensors are a threat to democracy.
Right.
Okay. On that note, I want to stop and thank you for the panel and turn it over to her. So, thank you. Thank you.